Hey everybody! It's the end of the month, which means it is time for another book review. I could have used a couple extra days of February. I was a little bit dissatisfied with the 28 days I was given, which doesn't usually happen. Usually I'm ready to get straight into March, but this month we had to tackle a pretty big book and pretty important book, and so a couple extra days might have helped me. But we'll dive into it. Because it's Heart Month, we were talking about heart health and how to prevent and reverse heart disease, which comes straight from this book, Dr. Esselstyn, Caldwell Esselstyn Jr. He was really a pioneer in the plant-based movement. Straight around the 80s, he really started to look into this stuff. We're gonna talk a little bit about his background and then dive into his research and what he's taken away from it and how he's promoting the plant-based diet for prevention and reversal of heart disease. So let's just dive right in. So his background, he was a surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic, and he really became dissatisfied with his options to heal through tertiary prevention. Rather than, preventing things from occurring, he was, on the third step, he was really helping to honestly just cut people apart, and that bothered him. And so he was really dissatisfied with the medical interventions, the stents, open heart surgeries, etc. His own father was a physician in New York State. His father-in-law was also a physician there at the Cleveland Clinic as well. And both of them passed away of heart disease, actually coronary artery disease. And they were both young and symptom-free when they died. So what are the reasons why we're talking about this? We've shared this before, but coronary artery disease is the leading killer in Western civilizations. 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women will have some form of it. The US spends about $250 billion annually, and this was in the early 2000s, so it's dramatically increased since then, just on heart disease. Almost all of that money is going to cardiac drugs, to clot dissolving meds, mechanical techniques to bypass clogged arteries. And even if these things are successful, they're only providing temporary relief. It's not a cure. And so Dr. Esselstyn really wanted to dive into this research, and what he found was really interesting. So he developed a study, and the goal of the study was to use plant-based nutrition and cholesterol-lowering meds in order to lower the participants' cholesterol below 150, and to see what effect that would have on coronary artery disease. So why? There was a Framingham heart study, which found after collecting data on patients for about 50 years and analyzing that data, that nobody who maintained a cholesterol level below 150 ever had a heart attack. The plant-based diet is not only void of added cholesterol, it also eliminates foods that injure vascular tissues, improving the endothelium as a whole. And we'll dive into that a little bit more in a second. So why meds? I know that sounds weird. We're really about natural resources and plant-based diets. So why meds? Well, with severe coronary artery disease, time is a luxury they don't always have. And so tackling that cholesterol and lowering it as quickly as possible is really the key, and sometimes it takes meds to do that. And in fact, studies have shown that lowering solely with medicine won't actually improve the condition. So we need the plant-based diet to really repair our arteries. So let's talk a bit about the study. So he met with patients aged between 43 and 67. All of the patients were so sick they'd run out of any other options. They had severe coronary artery disease, past care at the Cleveland Clinic, and collectively these patients all had 49 previous cardio events. So he met with them for about 45 minutes to 60 minutes for an interview, and about 18 stuck with this program. And so basically, these are the sickest of the sick. These are the patients who are essentially sent home to die. I mean, many of them reported in this book. He interviews many of them, and they said, I was basically said, pick out your rocker, that there's nothing left that medicine can offer. And some of them were directed to Dr. Esselstyn, not because the physicians necessarily or their cardiologists necessarily had faith in what he was doing, but because they didn't want to say there's nothing else we can do. And so many of the patients were literally on their last hope, and so they turned to this program. So what did they do? Every 2 weeks he reviewed their food logs. Every morsel of what they put in their mouth he went over note for note. He checked their blood pressure, their weight, their cholesterol. During the first year, he called patients with all these results. They made adjustments to the diet as needed throughout that first year. He didn't touch on exercise, which we've talked about is very important for cardiovascular health as well. But his concern was encouraging any additional changes to their lifestyle would detract from their discipline or their ability to focus on their diet change. And so he really wanted to put all of his effort and energy into changing their diet so dramatically and so drastically from the standard American diet. He wanted them to be able to focus on that. So the entire group, they gathered for fellowship every few months, and they were monitored for about 5 years using an analysis of angiograms, which is an x-ray of the coronary arteries. So the results. The average cholesterol began around 246 and it was lowered to 137. They used medicine, but they didn't use a dramatic amount of cholesterol lowering medicines, which many studies had been doing at the time. After about 12 years after the study had begun, they all had an average cholesterol below that 150 mark, which was his goal. So about 7 of the 18 participants couldn't have a follow-up at the 5-year mark, but of the 11 that did, disease progression was eliminated, and 8 even reversed their disease as shown on the angiograms. So his takeaway was, listen, improving the blood supply to the heart by way of improving the coronary arteries, lowering cholesterol will do that, and it will increase the capacity of the endothelium to produce nitric oxide, which is going to dilate the arteries, even diseased ones. Now we're going to dive into what that all means. So this was one of the things that I thought was most important about this book. He really describes to a T what we know about heart disease at this point. And so I felt like it was really important for me to share that with you. It's a little bit scientific and complicated, but if you'll bear with me, I think I can break it down in a way that will help you visualize what's going on. And so it's not just this big, broad disease that we don't have familiarity with, because I think it's important for us to be able to visualize what's going on in our body so that we know what we're eating is what that food is doing in our body to prevent those things. Okay, so here we go. Here are the general outlines of heart disease progression as we know it currently. So symptoms aren't like a bee sting, like we might suspect. They actually require decades of self-injury, many from high-fat diets, before clinical symptoms will actually develop. But cholesterol is carried through the bloodstream, and if it's at unsafe high levels, fat and cholesterol can be deposited on the endothelium. The endothelium is the lining of the blood vessels, and it's the single largest endocrine organ, in fact. So it's supposed to be, the endothelium is supposed to be strong, elastic, smooth, unobstructed to allow the blood to flow freely, right? But let's break down the development of plaque because that's what happens next. So as fats are in the bloodstream, fats in the bloodstream makes the endothelium, the white blood cells, and platelets all cause clotting and they become sticky and thick. So white blood cells will penetrate the endothelium and their job is to ingest the extra cholesterol and then they deliver it to the liver so that a body can get rid of it. That's their role. But when there's excess, what do? They call for backup. And so more white blood cells flood the area and they engorge themselves on all this extra cholesterol that we have in our blood, in our arteries. And what does that do? It clogs our artery, right? And so it creates this blockage or this narrowing, and it creates plaque. And that is the characteristic of atherosclerosis, if you've heard of that. So old plaque can contain scar tissue, calcium, and it can enlarge and narrow those arteries. And when we block the arteries, what we're doing is we're making it so that blood cannot be adequately supplied to the heart. And unfortunately, that muscle, deprived of this blood supply, will lead to chest pain, and that's what we call angina. So one quick note, only about 12% of fatal heart attacks are actually caused by complete blockage, which was interesting to me. I guess I always assume a heart attack is one of those issues where it's like, oh, blood was blocked, the whole thing must be clogged, heart attack occurs. But only 12% of the time the fatal heart attack is caused by that. Most are actually caused by younger fatty plaques. These don't generally cause symptoms. Okay, so this is where we talk about the fact that 1 in 4 patients, 1 in 4 heart attack patients, their first symptom of heart issue is sudden death. So let's keep going. So the lining covering these plaque ruptures, and then fatty deposits are leached out into the bloodstream. Okay, right? So the cholesterol, the white blood cells, they've engorged, they've created this plaque in the artery, and the plaque ruptures. And the fatty deposits inside that plaque then go into our bloodstream. The body responds naturally through clotting. And this clotting can completely close the area of the blood supply and cause it to die. And if the patient survives all of that, then the heart muscle will scar. Multiple attacks and scarring will then weaken the heart, and that is what we call congestive heart failure. All right, so those hopefully give you a greater idea of some of these common terms that you may be familiar with but not quite understand the process of how we get from one to the other. So let's talk a little bit more about like the main message. What is Dr. Esselstyn encouraging us to do, and how is he preventing this process to occur? So coronary artery disease, in his opinion, need not exist. And if it already does, it doesn't need to progress. So most of his patients, as I said, were at the far end of the spectrum. They are the sickest of the sick. They, at that point, already have many of these issues. As I said, the participants, there were already 49 cardiovascular events that they were dealing with. So most of them were working to reverse some of the issues that they already had going on in their systems. But his key is using plant-based nutrition, and if needed, cholesterol meds. Reducing cholesterol levels below the 150 mark will help to prevent and reverse heart disease. So meds can be instrumental for patients who already are without that luxury of time because they've spent decades injuring their arteries. There was a New England Journal of Medicine study that showed just dropping patients' cholesterol to 150 using meds. It still led to 1 in 4 of those patients having cardiovascular events or dying within 2.5 years. So we know it's not just about medicinally dropping these levels, but that there are additional things going on in our body when we use that plant-based diet as well in tandem. And so here's a visual for you. So if arterial plaque inflammation is the fire, then the standard American diet is pouring gasoline on it, okay? So what is his number one issue? We've got to abandon the standard American diet. Now, what does that look like to Dr. Esselstyn? And I'm gonna call him Essie because I love a good nickname, and that's what his family calls him. So it's also just a little bit of a mouthful. So Essie says, eat nothing with a mother or a face. Pretty easy to remember. Fish are included there. They're filled with toxins such as PCBs and mercury, which is a known hazard. Ever wonder why pregnant women are told to eat that sparingly? That's why. He wants no dairy, no oil, and in fact, no nuts and avocado. Now, he's really strict on oil. We're gonna dive directly into that in a little bit, but specifically with regard to fat, he's mostly concerned about those patients who are already in the cardiovascular injury area. So for many of us who are younger or just don't have any of those symptoms or injury yet to our arteries, fat can be introduced in a healthy way through whole food, plant-based. So he's okay with walnuts occasionally if you don't already have heart disease. Now, for our family's sake, I have young kids. Fat is extremely important for young growing brains. So there are definitely areas that, he's speaking to an audience of people who are generally a little bit older and have had decades of injury that they're trying to reverse. So we take all this and we kind of pare it down to how it fits best with our family, our lifestyle, and our needs based on what we have going on with our health. So he says, why no fat? So eating fat causes the body to manufacture excessive amounts of cholesterol. So plant-based diet is already void of cholesterol, but fat can actually encourage our bodies to make more than we don't need. And if you remember back to how heart disease is developed, it's excess cholesterol in our arteries, which is causing those white blood cells to climb in there, to leach onto them. And unfortunately, if there's too much, then they can clog and cause plaques. And that's, again, the beginning of that cascade. He wants no refined grains, 100% whole grains only. and they really encourage checking the nutrition label. I've said that for years too as well. You just never know when there's hidden milk or hidden dairy products somewhere deep in the bottom of the list. It's usually whey or casein in our circumstances. But he wants to also avoid hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated products, which contain the most harmful trans fats. All right, so let's dive into, I don't know if you remember from our last book, but we talked about short chain fatty acids being like the power of the gut, right? And so we were focusing on like, how can we get more short chain fatty acids through fiber consumption, which fuels our microbiome to produce these amazing short chain fatty acids. So for the heart, what we need, and for actually any vascular repair, what we're looking for is actually nitric oxide. We touched on this recently. We talked about beets a little bit and how beets are great for this. I'm gonna give you a couple other ideas as well. But here's why. So nitric oxide is a vasodilator, and it's made by the endothelial cells, which helps vessels to dilate or enlarge. And it's essential to vascular health, and in fact, it won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1998. So an abundance of nitric oxide in the blood allows cells to slip and slide through the bloodstream as if it was coated by Teflon, as opposed to cholesterol, which does the opposite, right? Cholesterol's sticky, which makes everything thick and slow to get through the blood cells. To allow the blood cells to slip through the bloodstream. So let's talk about a quick study that looks into nitric oxide. So Dr. Robert Vogel, he did a BART breakfast study. BART is an acronym, and it stands for bronchial artery tourniquet, something like that. So sorry about that. But basically what he did was he divided this group into two groups. Half of the participants were given breakfast with 50 grams of fat, and the other half were given a breakfast with no fat, 0 grams of fat. Before and after the food, they were all measured. Using a tourniquet, they measured the diameters of their bronchial arteries, and they restricted the blood flow using that tourniquet before and after eating. So what they found was the participants who were given fat at breakfast took 6 hours longer for their endothelial function to normalize than those who were not eating fat. So basically what we're saying is we're restricting that blood flow, and in order to fix that restriction, to get the endothelial cells back to where they should be, the arteries back to where they should be, the fat caused that to be slower. Okay, so lack of fat helps to normalize our endothelial cells. Improving nitric oxide levels can restore the endothelium function and end angina, which is that painful chest pain that people experience who have had cardiovascular events. It can be devastating to people. And it, in many cases in the book, there were patients that talked about how they basically quit living because they were so afraid to overexert themselves and to cause another heart event because of that angina. So how do we increase our levels of nitric oxide? I know that's what you want to know. So suffice it to say that he breaks down this really biochemical, beautiful chart. For our purposes, I wasn't going to be able to really recreate that for you. So let me just break down the most important aspect of it. So we need to create a substance called L-arginine. And there is a chemical that, unfortunately, or a substance that detracts from that. It's made within our body based on the protein that we eat. But there are things that promote the good stuff, and there are things just like the short chain fatty acids in our gut. There are things that promote the good stuff, and there are things that threaten the bad stuff, okay? So eating legumes, beans, soy, and nuts are really gonna help us to promote the L-arginine, which helps facilitate nitric oxide production. As opposed to the cardio risk factors, which are true for, the reason we don't want to have cardiovascular events. We want to prevent high lipids, insulin resistance, high blood pressure, tobacco use. These all threaten the creation of that L-arginine, which helps to create the facilitation of nitric oxide. All right, so, I know that one of the issues with the plant-based diet and adoption of the plant-based diet is it's not so much about not believing that this research is true. but there are just so many barriers to making these changes. And so we're going to talk about a couple of them in terms of the heart disease recommendations. Okay, so one of the barriers to change is that there's just little incentive for physicians to study alternate ways to manage this disease. Mechanical and procedural approach, they dominate because they get paid for it, right? So physicians and researchers are beginning to agree that lifestyle changes are essential to overall health, but we're not there yet. Cardiology procedures generate a huge revenue for hospitals. I mean, this was the main focus of my master's program was, hey, what are we going to do about this? Because our healthcare system is floundering, and we're paying for things that aren't effective, and there's no money for working together and working in tandem in prevention. So this is still being talked about. I mean, this was just a few years ago, and so we're still working on changing our payment systems and our insurance, everything to make it a little bit more leaning toward lifestyle changes. But as of right now, and when the book was written, of course, 20 years ago, it just wasn't there. So it's far easier for insurance companies to document and quantify, mechanical and procedural approaches rather than lifestyle changes. And there is an element too for physicians that, they don't necessarily have the time. We've talked about this. They don't have the time to educate on plant-based diets. Even if they felt comfortable doing that, they haven't been given that information outside of their own research. It's not really discussed to this point in medical schools. And so they don't have the confidence, and they don't really have the time or resources. They're not being given, they're not being paid for the time to coach people in lifestyle medicine. So it's a lot easier to let a patient walk out of the office with a prescription when the confidence the doctor has that, hey, at least if they actually follow through with this prescription, just taking a pill once a day, I can have the confidence that it will lower, their cholesterol, for instance. So, researchers and providers still believe patients would never follow the diet. And this is a big frustration that I have just with my personality. So basically, you're not giving us a chance to make the decisions for ourselves. You're watering the information down, assuming that we can't do it. So, one quote that was kind of popular throughout all of these patients that met with Dr. Esselstyn was, "I can't believe they never told me. I can't believe I got to the point that I was at where I'd already had all of these stents and bypass surgeries and everything had failed, and I had done, multiple bypass surgeries, and they never told me all I needed to do was take on a new lifestyle change." So I'm going to read a quick quote. This is actually from Colin Campbell, who wrote the China study. And I just felt like this was really valuable. He was speaking to a group of physicians and providers at the First National Conference on Lipids and the Elimination and Prevention of Coronary Artery Disease. So he says, "If we are reasonably sure of what our data from these studies are telling us, why must we be reticent about recommending a diet which we know is safe and healthy? Scientists can no longer take the attitude that the public cannot benefit from information they're not ready for. We must have the integrity to tell them the truth and let them decide what to do with it. We cannot force them to follow the guidelines we recommend, but we can give them these guidelines and let them decide. I personally have great faith in the public. We must tell them that a diet of roots, stems, seeds, flowers, fruits, and leaves is the healthiest diet and the only diet that we can promote, endorse, and recommend." And so this just follows a pretty common theme throughout the plant-based world. That's just a frustration that the research is being watered down. The results of some of these studies, even when they're unbiased studies, are being diluted because people don't believe that the public has the ability or the discipline to make these changes in their diets. So there is speculation about the degree of public compliance, and it can't influence the accuracy of the recommendations that are given. Now, again, this book was written 20 years ago, but they just came out with recommendations for dietary recommendations last month. And there was still an air of frustration that what was brought out from the unbiased committee who was doing the research was watered down and was changed by political forces, by lobbyists, and it was adjusted when it was promoted. And so there's registered dietitians, pediatricians, family practice physicians, a ton of people. I would encourage you to dive in there and look at the changes that came out, which many of which are great. They've made some great progress, but they're still watering things down. So There's also a moderation mentality, and this is probably the thing that I get the most pushback on. So why, maybe outside of why no oils, but why can't I just do meatless Mondays? Why is it not okay at this age for me to just tackle a little bit at a time? So let's dive into it. There was a study done, the Women's Health Initiative, which studied 49,000 women for about 8 years. And those who followed a low-fat diet had the exact same rates of heart attacks, cancers, strokes, and as those who followed a standard American diet. The takeaway was, okay, low-fat diet doesn't reduce these risks. Well, when you dive into the research, you find that a low-fat diet for them was being considered as 29% calories from fat, where Esselstyn would recommend that we eat 10% or less, which is dramatic compared to the standard American diet, but that would be considered a low-fat diet. So let's use another example to kind of view this line of logic, okay? Let's consider a car crash test, which was studying the fatality of occupants in a car when crashed at the speed of, let's say, 90 miles per hour, as opposed to a car crash at 70 miles per hour. Well, if you looked at these results and you found that they were fatal in all circumstances, you might say, speed has no effect on the fatality of car crashes. When in reality, we know that if a car crashed at 10 miles per hour, it's unlikely that any of the occupants would die. So it's all in how they phrase it. And if you look at it and you just assume, well, no one could adopt a diet that had lower calories from fat than 29%, then I guess you could, deem that, okay, there's no diet that, low-fat diet's not gonna help. But Esselstyn says, hey, let's put that in front of the people. Let's say, okay, well, 29% didn't make a difference. Let's try 20, let's try 15. And so that's basically what his study did. And so his study looked at a diet of about 10% is what he recommends. 10% of his calories come from fat. The tricky thing here, and the tricky thing for me, is that this is a lifestyle where I don't count calories. I don't have a calorie restriction. I don't need to monitor points or anything like that. And so it's difficult for me to know exactly what percentage of my diet is coming from fat. But it's important. And so it's something that I'll definitely monitor in the future. And so why is it important to abstain from any amount of harmful foods? Cell membranes are so delicate and yet so essential to the integrity of a healthy functioning cell. Oils and animal products, as I said, release cascades of free radicals, harmful chemicals that injure the metabolic system. And they can never fully heal. The effects accumulate and they become disease. But plants don't induce this process. In fact, they carry the antidote, antioxidants, which neutralize these free radicals and they deter cancer. And so that's why it's important to not continue to injure especially for those who already have injury to their heart and to their arteries, to not re-injure it through even the smallest amount of harmful foods. And so I'm not going to dive into this very much. I touched on it just a minute ago, but as a pioneer of the plant-based movement, he really got in on the ground floor, and there are several physicians that he lists that, many of which I've heard of before, but some of them I haven't. And so I definitely wrote those down. But there are pioneers in this field that really banded together because there was intense pressure from not only political pressure, governmental pressure, but their own colleagues. They basically were saying, hey, what we've been doing isn't the best for our patients, and that's hard to hear. And so there's a lot of pressure that they endured as pioneers in this movement. And so naturally he has what I might consider I don't want to call it he's skeptical, but he definitely dives in pretty deeply into the political climate around a lot of this research. I believe that a lot of it has been improved in the 20 years since this book came out. I think physicians are definitely a lot more aware of and being rewarded for promoting these types of things, but they weren't back then. And so he'll dive into that, and so you can read that. And it's interesting to note just to see where we've been and where we're going, especially for someone who adopted it later, to see what they went through and all that they had to overcome, and for our grocery store shelves to be filled with the plant-based foods that we have available to us now. So I'm thankful for pioneers like him. All right. So what's the typical Western diet? Why is that an issue? So there are epidemiological studies that almost all chronic ailments are in Western countries. And so, for instance, US women are 20 times more likely to develop breast cancer than those in Kenya. It's almost unknown in Japan to have many of these chronic ailments until they adopt a Western diet and lifestyle. And the same is true for colon, prostate, ovary cancers, and diabetes and obesity. All right, so we're gonna tackle, and I'm sorry, let me touch on there too. The China study really dives into that stuff as well. So they look into the Chinese diet and lifestyle and their lack of disease. And it's fascinating. It's definitely the book that drove my fact-driven husband down this plant-based road. So now we're gonna tackle oils. I know this is a huge topic. I definitely get the most pushback on oil and the most confusion on oil. So let's dive in. So the Lion Diet Heart Study is basically the beginning of the Mediterranean diet craze. And this is the reason we now market oils as heart healthy. So we're basically putting all of our eggs in this study. So let's look at this study. Participants had all had previous heart attacks and all had similar risk factors. Half were asked to eat a diet high in veggies, bread, cereal, potatoes, beans, nuts, seeds, olive oil, as well as dairy, fish, poultry, which was low to moderate consumption, and little red meat. They were asked to only eat eggs about 4 times or less a week, and wine in moderation. So at the 4-year mark, the study ended, and those on that diet were 50 to 70% less likely to experience cardiac ailments like angina, stroke, heart failure, or even death than the participants that were encouraged to simply eat prudently, which was documented as basically a standard American diet. So after the study, after those 4 years, 1 in 4 of those participants had a new cardiovascular event or died. So Colin Campbell was asked about this. I mentioned that he wrote the China study. He was asked about the Mediterranean diet because it was so similar to the diet of those he studied in China. And his response was the rural China diets he studied, coronary disease is practically non-existent. He said the diets are practically the same, except the absence of oil in the Chinese diet, which had a superior success in terms of coronary disease. So about 14 to 17% of olive oil is saturated artery clogging fat, and it's every bit as aggressive in promoting heart disease as the saturated fat in roast beef. There is no difference virtually chemically inside of our body when you derive that saturated fat from the olive oil versus a roast beef. Studies including the influence of diet on the appearance of new lesions in the heart in human coronary arteries show identical coronary artery disease progression using angiogram analysis for those consuming monounsaturated fats or oil as compared with saturated fats. And in fact, a study in monkeys who metabolize fat very similarly as humans, it basically showed that after 5 years, there were 2 groups. One was consuming monounsaturated fat. Their HDL was improved and their LDL declined, but they had just as much coronary artery disease as those that were fed saturated fat. And then they repeated that same study in rodents and found the same thing. So while it may help cholesterol, it's not helping the coronary artery disease. So just a quick explanation on some of these mechanical interventions that we talked about. So there's angioplasty, which is basically where they press the plaque against the artery wall. They break it and strip it away from the endothelial lining. Stents use wire mesh tubes to hold open blocked arteries. And by the way, about 4% of patients who get stents have heart attacks during the process, and about 1% die during it. When I was looking up, because this was 20 years ago, when I was looking up how things have changed, there's been a dramatic difference and a dramatic change in the use of stents. And in fact, if you type in anything related to outcomes after stents, you'll find that stents are highly they're not promoted quite as much as they used to be, with reason. So, and then there's bypass, which is a little bit more familiar, I think, to many of us, but it's the use of a vessel from elsewhere to go around a clog. Interestingly, that was invented by a surgeon who shared a locker at the Cleveland Clinic with Dr. Esselstyn. And he remarked that, it was very interesting that they should be so close and yet their careers take them in such different directions. And even, I forget the physician's name who invented it, but, even in later years, he kind of backtracked and said, look, this should be a Band-Aid. This should not be our go-to solution for heart disease. All of these interventions are aimed at alleviating symptoms, but they're not curing the disease, and the results are going to erode with time, which is why you see second bypass surgeries, additional stents, multiple angioplasties. And unfortunately, if you look at the results, bypasses, for instance, patients who undergo bypass surgery have about a 2.5% chance of dying. And based on the quality of this intervention at the time of publication of this book, that meant 10,000 people. And it's gone up significantly since then. So, if you consider that, hey, we're promoting something that's causing at least 10,000 deaths, this obviously should not be the first thing we turn to when we have cardiovascular events. Now, in his final thoughts, he gives tons of ideas. The whole back of the book is recipes that he and his wife have come up with. They give final thoughts on things like I mentioned, the other pioneers that are doing very similar work and have found very similar results. Dr. Dean Ornish is one that he promotes very highly. He is the author of the starch solution, and he's from Hawaii, and he basically was seeing that, hey, none of these native Hawaiians have all of these American issues until they're, generations later, and they start adopting the American diet, and all of a sudden it's turned on. They're actually eating things that would be contrary to what we're promoting in terms of our nutrition guidelines. So he's very fascinating. I've done a lot of research on him. In fact, I think I quoted him just the other day. He touches on several other areas of the body, and there's tons of quotes about, look, what's good for the heart is good for the brain, because you're trying to prevent blockages in vessels. Well, there's vessels going to the brain too. And so when you're doing good things for your heart vessels and your heart arteries, you're promoting and removing the risk for stroke and other issues in the brain, and several other areas of the body as well. He would love to see, I referenced that BART study. He would love to see, he said, this is a fantasy of mine, but I'd love to see that scale being used on prepackaged foods, on menu items, as almost the calorie count that people look at, and they can compare and say, look, this is what's going to be done to my arteries if I eat this food. And it gives you a scale, and it helps you to just make an informed decision about that food. Obviously that hasn't happened. I don't see that happening. There was a big pushback with, if you'll recall, a few years ago, putting calories on menus and things like that. So we're not there yet, but maybe one day. And he had some closing thoughts as well I just wanted to share with you. He said, those who practice medicine must engage in a new covenant with the public to never underestimate the layman's ability to adopt healthier lifestyles. Convey knowledge that empowers individuals to take control of their own health. And that's one of the things that I took away, one of the biggest things I took away from this book is the reality that we have this control. All of these patients who went through this study, they realized after the fact, I could have been controlling this the whole time, and I just didn't have the information or the ability to do so. Now, I am not naive enough to believe that we're all just going to dive into this. It's a difficult plan. I get it. Removing oils and removing fats from our diet, we have an addiction to that stuff, just like sugar and just like any other addictive substance that we see in our culture. And so it takes a while, but there's data and there's information in there about how long it takes for our bodies to adjust. And I can just share from personal experience. Typically, I eat a very low-fat diet, but we do include oil because we go out to eat sometimes, or we use processed foods because, look, I'm on my fourth baby. We're in the global pandemic. We're gonna do what we gotta do, right? But what I've noticed is when I do eat that way for a while, first of all, I start feeling terrible. And then when I decide, okay, I've got to just nip this in the bud, I feel those cravings. I feel that draw to sugar. Even if I haven't been eating sugar, if I've been eating more fat, I feel a sugar craving that I don't usually get after eating meals. I have found that 1 week is what it takes for me typically to be able to turn those cravings off. And, start somewhere. With oils especially, I know that's one of the biggest hurdles for people. What works for us is I just don't cook with it. And how much I'm eliminating from just not sauteing my onions, which will be in the pot full of other flavors, you'll never notice that oil. So just eliminate the stuff you're cooking with. Find substitutes for your baking goods. So you're still eating and enjoying your banana bread, but you're using applesauce instead of oil, or your pancakes, but you're using applesauce instead of oil. I have found so many creative ways around this, and many other people have shared them with me, and I'm more than happy to share them with you as well. One tip I've shared that Asian restaurants are fabulous for going out to eat when you're looking for vegan options, but they are terrible about actually following through with the please don't add oil to our rice or our pasta. But what we found is that we can wipe off with napkins. If we're at a restaurant, we can wipe off our pasta. And then actually if we bring it home, we often just rinse it under the sink in a strainer and get rid of a lot of that oil that way as well. So I would encourage you to look at ways that you are already consuming extra fats and see if you can identify alternatives to eliminate some of that. Slowly but surely turn the dial on your both cholesterol through animal product consumption and your oils and fats. I will still be doing my chia, hemp, and flaxseed just like normal because we don't have heart disease. We're still doing nuts and nut butters, and we are highly promoting healthy fats in our growing children who obviously need that desperately for their brains. So those were my big takeaways. I'd love to hear yours if you dive into this book or if you're familiar with the plan. He has a special cookbook that goes along with it. There's plenty of recipes in the back as well. I think that's all I got for you. All right, so I hope you guys had some great takeaways from this. I'll definitely link a couple great articles and studies and point you in the direction. There was so much I couldn't share, but I wanted to. So I hope you guys get some good takeaways and have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.